Oh, we get it. Oh, that's good. And we are live. Liam, YouTube, hello. Let's see, can we see, has anybody joined yet? I guess the benefit of YouTube is we can always start. So hello to everyone that's here with us and welcome to the live stream. Today I'm joined by Liam from SimplyVAT. SimplyVAT are EU VAT specialists, and probably should introduce myself as well for anybody who doesn't know who I am. So my name's Joe. I'm the founder and managing partner of E-commerce Accountants, the UK's leading accountancy for e-commerce businesses. I have been working with SimplyVAT, well, probably ever since E-commerce Accountants started. So that was about 9 years ago. I think it was a couple of years after that. So 7 years I've been working with SimplyVAT. The team are amazing, super knowledgeable. So I thought I'd get Liam to join us here. Hi, Richard. Get Liam here to speak about EU VAT. So over to you, Liam.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, my name's Liam. I am a business development and partnerships manager from SimplyVAT. So I handle kind of day-to-day conversations with clients who are looking at growing cross-border. I've got to live up to the expert label that Joe's now put on me. But we handle a lot of kind of different clients who are growing cross-border, EU, Canada, and UK for non-UK businesses. So we can kind of support those businesses that are growing into the UK, they're EU based, for example. But we typically, and the point of today's session is going to be looking at kind of those back to basics of that kind of EU VAT side of things. What we're going to be doing, so shortly I'll go through a few slides, but we'll just go through kind of, the basic rules, try and clear up any questions that, have come up. I know, Joe, we've got a bit of a Q&A time towards the end as well. So obviously, if any questions pop up during my slides, please do feel free to pop them in. And then I'll try my best to answer the questions that Joe throws at me shortly.
Can I throw a curveball at you right now?
If you
Don't
want
worry,
to.
it's not too scary. So SimplyVAT, obviously, we usually at e-commerce accounts work with e-commerce businesses. Do you guys work with any type of business, or is it just e-commerce?
So we typically work with any types of businesses. I mean, I guess our bread and butter, I would say, would probably be e-commerce. We built it looking at kind of that e-commerce growth. So we do have a lot of like Amazon clients, Shopify clients, all that kind of stuff. But since we've kind of been growing the business, we have also gathered a portfolio of wholesale clients and, more professional services leaning in that sector. But we do have a lot of primarily, and do still primarily focus on e-com. But yeah, we don't kind of just do e-com anymore. But yeah.
Perfect. And just for anybody watching, if as we're going, if you've got any questions, please put them in the comments. We can see them coming through on the right, so we can see Richard just said hello and hello again. And while we might not immediately jump on them, towards the end there's a live Q&A, so we will cover them. So feel free to just send them through. And there's a couple of people in the background who will be responding and helping out. So yeah, shoot away.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I guess without any further ado then, I'll jump in and we can start going through the slideshow. So yeah, I'll just get these on. Perfect. So yeah, we're looking at the back to basics, as I mentioned, of EU VAT. So we're going to be going through a few main basic rules about EU VAT expansion and what you need to consider when you're growing into the EU. So the first thing that we're going to look at is going to be, how do I know where to tax when I sell into the EU? You've got a few main questions which you can see on screen, but what you need to look at, I would say, are what is the nature of the tax transaction? Are you doing a good or a service? Is it digital, physical? Is the client business to business, or is it a general consumer, like direct to consumer sale? Where are the goods going from and to? So are they held inside the EU, outside the EU? And then also, more importantly, who actually needs to account for that VAT? You know, is it yourself? Is it the supplier? Is it your customer? Are you selling on a marketplace? All that kind of stuff. So those are the main questions that we're going to try and aid with clarifications on throughout the slides. And then, yeah, we'll see. Hopefully we can get some clarity for you, everyone. Yes, Joe. Sorry, Joe, you're on mute. I think I can see you with a question.
Thank you. So I thought it would save my air conditioning unit making loads of noise in the background. And for anyone watching, you might usually think, oh, well, I sell in Germany, German rate is 19%. But actually, as you can see here, there's so much more to it when it comes to VAT. And it's why I refer out, any EU VAT stuff to SimplyVAT, because there's so much complexity that you really need someone who knows what they're doing. Sorry, Liam,
No, I think that's a great point as well, because when you look at the transaction, actually, it's a great point you mentioned Germany, because Germany and UK actually follow very similar rules. So there's no domestic reverse charge in Germany. So it is a great starting point for like UK sellers, because you don't have to relearn a whole bunch of VAT rules. But it is, you just got to consider a few other points. For example, if it's like a digital service, it may not be taxable, but if it's a good, it probably will be. But it depends on who the importer of record is, which we'll kind of get to shortly. But yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and hopefully we'll be able to clear some things up. The other thing, I guess, to key highlight as we go through today's kind of slides is going to be the one-stop shop schemes. So when Brexit happened in 2021, and we got kind of the new VAT rules and the July 2021 reform in the EU, there was 3 OSSs developed. They're kind of there for different things, and we'll look at each individual one. But these are simplification schemes, so they really help those clients that are growing into the EU. It kind of removes the need to get those local, every single VAT number moving forward. But yeah, we'll kind of delve a bit further into that shortly. The other thing to key highlight, there is a lot on here, so I'm not going to go through it word by word, but the main triggers for a VAT registration and what requires this would be, you've got to consider a few main things. That would be holding stock, any DDP, so that's delivery duty paid supplies to customers in the EU from an outside the EU location. And if you're acting as the importer of record on B2B supplies, so similar kind of DDP and acting as the importer of record, but you will find that it's slightly different depending on who you're kind of selling to, where they're located as well. So that B2B aspect is a little bit different sometimes, but it will depend on a few rules. The other key thing to highlight, which I think some people do get a bit confused on, is pre-Brexit, there were distance selling thresholds, so you could sell freely, with VAT collected from the UK to Germany, and you had a bit of a threshold on that. Since we are no longer an EU member state in the UK, for UK businesses and also for non-EU businesses in general, there is no kind of threshold you need to hit prior to needing that VAT registration. So if you are selling, from the UK over to the EU, or from your warehouse in US over to the EU, and you're collecting VAT on that transaction, it will trigger either a need for one of those OSS simplification schemes, or it will trigger a need for you to get that local VAT registration, which will very much depend on exactly kind of what your supply is looking at.
And I'm sure we cover this later, but does that mean that, let's say, so I'm a Shopify business, I store goods in the UK, I make a sale in France, that I immediately need to register in France, or is it that I can register in France, or should?
So, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it depends on how you ship it. So if you are shipping it under the DDP Incoterm, you're collecting that VAT at checkout, you need to register from that first taxable supply. Now, a lot of tax offices do allow retroactive, the backdating. They allow you to basically reconcile any kind of past and owed VAT. So, if you have already made sales, there's nothing really to worry about there. We can definitely get you sorted, and that's how us and the team at SimplyVAT can support. But I would say yeah, as soon as you know you've made that sale, you can ship. You would need to get that French VAT number, or the import one-stop shop scheme. It does depend on the kind of actual, how much the goods are. I'll go into the IOS kind of rules shortly, but yeah, I think it really does depend. Or you don't need to collect VAT at all in the EU, which is another special rule. So they don't have any kind of threshold or anything like that. So you can just ship it, but it pushes that onto your end customer.
And just one more question there. So DDP obviously means delivery duties paid, and the
Yeah.
shipping there is usually more expensive, right? So if I'm a business using DDP shipping, it will cost me more because the delivery, the duties, I imagine, are inside that. Is that right?
So yeah, technically, duties duties technically get settled at border. So when you kind of ship under a DDP Incoterm, it usually means that upon the goods landing in that border, you would cover both duties and the import VAT that's due on that transaction. So I wouldn't necessarily say it kind of costs more. So import VAT is reclaimable, as long as you're set up in the correct kind of manner for that. And duties, unfortunately, they are non-reclaimable. Duties are a bit more complex. It's not typically something we really handle, just because it varies of, the origin of the goods, where they were manufactured. But I believe, from kind of conversations, that goods manufactured in the UK, there's actually a duty exemption rule when they go into the EU. But again, I don't know too much on that, unfortunately. But
I guess
yeah,
sorry to jump in. The thing
of
that
course.
jumped out to me was with DDP. I know
Yeah.
some people would say, "Well, aren't my duties and taxes already paid?" And you've mentioned that might trigger a need to actually be registered in a country. Whereas I could see some people being like, "Well, I do DDP. Do I? I didn't think I needed to register."
Yeah, I think that's a great point to highlight, because it actually is quite a good point that comes up in like the majority of my day-to-day conversations. I would say that when it comes to kind of like DDP shipments, the it's actually import VAT that typically is settled. It's not the actual VAT on that transactional supply. So when you say import, let's just use I'm going to use Germany as an example, because France has postponed VAT accounting. So you technically don't settle anything at the border in France. But if you import into Germany, when you import, you'll obviously cover, if you ship it DDP, you do import VAT and duties. However, what that doesn't cover is that 19% VAT that you've collected on that direct consumer sale. So that's where you still require that, VAT registration to remit that to the tax offices. Now, a lot of kind of shipping providers do offer a DDP solution. I would always recommend kind of just looking a bit deeper into those, just because, from experience, a lot of the time it's mainly just that import VAT that's being kind of remitted. It's not the actual, you know, supply VAT. So it's just making sure that if you have collected that supply VAT at checkout, that it is set up to be remitted. Or even, especially, if you look at IOSS, there's no import VAT due. So if your goods are below €150, you could use the import one-stop shop scheme, and you don't actually pay import VAT or duties, because it's all kind of covered under there. So it's a bit of a special exemption scheme.
Again, shows the importance of working with someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, my coffee's still settling in this morning, but hopefully we'll kind of get clarifications. But yeah, if we kind of jump onto that next slide, perfect. We're leading into the IOS. So as we've kind of discussed briefly, obviously so the import one-stop shop, it was one of the 3 OSS schemes that kind of came following that July 2021 reform. The IOS, it is an optional scheme. So it's an optional scheme for you if you're wanting to collect VAT on no checkout, remit that and kind of take that away and take the burden away from your end customer, because that is unfortunately unavoidable. So it's either you collect it at checkout, or your end customer would need to pay that and settle it upon receiving those goods. So it just kind of removes that burden from them. But it's a simplified scheme that requires you, allows you to collect that rather than getting those local 27 EU member state VAT numbers, which obviously, as I'm sure you can imagine, can be a bit more ease of that admin and kind of VAT payments on a once a month basis. It's there to allow you to report VAT due on the distant sales of imported goods, shipped in a consignment valued up to €150. And it allows businesses to basically, as I mentioned, collect and report the VAT due on imported goods to consumers in the EU in a singular return and a singular payment. UK businesses do require an IOSS intermediary. Similar to SimplyVAT, we act as an intermediary for our clients under the Import One Stop Shop. So it allows us to do that. What you'll also notice, and what a lot of people watching, and maybe yourself, Joe, may be familiar with, is marketplaces can also use the Import One Stop Shop. So Amazon offer utilization of their IOSS number for goods going to the EU below that 150 kind of threshold.
And that'll be where they collect it, the VAT, and remit it on the seller's behalf, right?
Yeah, so it's for kind of marketplaces that act as that deemed supplier. So a lot of the main ones that we look at, so I believe TikTok Shop acts as deemed supplier, Amazon do, eBay, Etsy, they would kind of give you their IOSS number for those kind of goods going across that hit that below threshold. And I think it's a great kind of place to start for people that are looking to grow their businesses cross-border as well, because it's, as we mentioned, simplified, especially if you're using a marketplace, but it gives you further insight into where your markets, could be. Your goods might be popular in a certain market, for example, so it can help really forward plan that growth and expansion without kind of, having that admin burden of many, many registrations until you're ready to kind of grow to that point. And then if we look at it in a separate way as well, obviously we've mentioned that the value is that below that 150 threshold. Obviously, a lot of times clients will do, different things where they have goods that, majority fall under, but you might have 2 to 5% of their sales that do go above. For those, you do have a couple of different options. So you can either ship under an Incoterm at DAP, which is delivered at place, where your goods will land with the end customer. They cover that VAT, and they will also cover duties because they do attract duties when the goods are above €150. Or you can obviously gain that local VAT registration in that member state where you say have those sales too. I see it quite often where clients may have a particular member state where they do have a really big boost in those sales, and that product may be most popular. So I think that could always be a great option, but it really does depend on the actual, trajectory of your kind of sales and plan, but it varies.
Just again, sorry if I'm jumping ahead. I'm trying to
No
sit on my
worries.
hands here. Is there ever, because you say we've got the IOSS, so you can register for all 27 in one.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like a no-brainer. However, I know some people do register in individual countries, and you mentioned about reclaiming VAT. Is there ever an advantage to register in these countries, or a reason that you might only register in one rather than on the IOSS, or both even?
I think it's a really great question, and I think it really depends on the kind of client and the business kind of plans. So, for example, the IOSS does not allow you to hold stock. So, if you are, say, utilizing your Shopify, so you're a multi-channel seller, you've got, say, Shopify and Amazon, but you want to grow Amazon UK and DE, you need that German VAT number to hold your stock in Germany, reclaim any import VAT going into Germany, all that kind of good stuff. But the IOSS would allow you to do those Shopify shipments under that €150 going across the border into the EU. So I think it varies depending on what your kind of plans are. But I would say the main benefits are obviously holding stock, you need a local reg. But if you're not ready to hold stock, your goods are majority below that 150, I would really, push a client to explore the IOSS because I do think it gives you great insights. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. So is my understanding correct then? So if you're going to store goods in a country, so one setup I see a lot of people do is they store goods in the Netherlands, I guess maybe there's cheaper shipping or cheaper import there. And then they might sell it else, distribute it across the EU. So based on that, you're saying they would need to locally register in the Netherlands and then register for the IOSS for everyone else, because the goods are, even though it's within the EU, they're still being dispersed. Is that right?
So that's actually going to be a different scheme, which we're going to jump onto in a
Yeah.
minute. The Netherlands, so when you've got stock held locally, you know, if you're moving all distribution to a local centre, and Netherlands, you are correct, it is a really popular option. It's mainly, and I don't know whether this is correct, but my understanding is it's one of the main shipping ports. So obviously, when your goods are coming by sea, they would either likely go Netherlands, France, or Germany. So typically, those are the three most popular kind of countries that I tend to have discussions with clients on expanding into. So when it goes into the Netherlands, if the goods are going locally, all distribution is going to be from there. It would go under a union OSS, so you wouldn't need the IOSS. But I think that is actually, funny enough, my next slide. So
And do say, Liam, I know you're very polite, but just question. We'll cover that in a moment. Please be quiet.
no, it's all good. No, don't worry. I think it's great because it leads us into it. So obviously, we've just kind of briefly gone on that union OSS, but as we've mentioned, it is so. Again, it's an optional scheme, but it's probably one that I would recommend more so than I would the IOSS, because it just makes it a bit easier for clients when it comes to reporting. So let's say your Shopify own website, you've got stock. Let's use your example, Joe, of Netherlands. So we'll get you that Netherlands VAT number, and then you get a Union one-stop shop registration, which allows you to basically hold stock in the Netherlands, direct to consumer ship to all member states around the EU, and removes that need for those local registrations. So again, optional scheme, but something that I would recommend.
Sorry, one other question is because
Of
I
course.
always struggled actually with this union, non-union. In my head, union meant you were actually part of the EU, and non-union was like if you're a UK business. So is it actually, it sounds more like you're saying it's if you have a union registration or if your goods are stored there, it's union. How do you explain the difference?
So the union one-stop shop, and that's a great question again, because we do get that quite a lot. I think it can be sometimes confusing. The union OSS is for anyone, whether they're kind of UK based, EU based, or based in the US. It's for anyone holding stock in the EU that can utilize it. So it doesn't matter if you're non-EU established. It would fall under the scope of the union OSS, and it's because the goods are held inside the EU at point of checkout,
Right.
and you've got that kind of local VAT number. The non-union OSS, which I think we'll jump onto in a second, but that's for digital supplies. So I personally, I do agree with you. Sometimes it can be a little bit confusing, but the non-union OSS used to be the mini one-stop shop, basically, because the mini one-stop shop was pre-Brexit, and it allowed kind of digital sales, which transferred into non-union, which could have been called something a little bit different, but obviously
That's why I found it so confusing, because I grew up and trained under Mini One Stop Shop.
Yeah.
And yeah, when they changed the names, okay.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I think maybe they could have gone with like a digital one-stop shop or something to just enable that less confusion. But yeah, that is kind of the key difference for it. The other thing as well that I would say with the kind of union OSS, so typically now this is exclusively through kind of SimplyVAT, I would say. It's more so when you come to like obviously registrations, the person who you're working with, so the tax agent such as ourselves, when the union OSS, you can register in the country where you're going to be holding that stock. So, for example, in Netherlands, we'd get you a Netherlands OSS. But through the non-union OSS, it depends on where we've got the kind of license for registration. So, as I mentioned, we act as an intermediary for IOSS. We've got our license set up through Ireland. So, anyone who kind of comes on board with us, their OSS number would be registered through Ireland. And that would be the same with the non-union OSS. So you've got a little bit less, I guess, I don't want to say the word freedom, but for lack of better, it would, you don't really have the choice of where you register. Whereas with the union OSS, you register in the country where you're holding that stock locally, just for those intra-EU distance sale of goods and, for that B2C cross-border sale, that would fall under the Netherlands scope. But yeah, as I mentioned, if we lead into non-union OSS, it again is an optional scheme, but it does, make a bit more sense if you are doing especially low volume of sales, but it is completely up to the kind of, business themselves. And it's for digital sales made to EU consumers. Now, there was a really fun change that happened on January 1st this year, where the EU actually changed a few rules surrounding the non-union OSS, which I don't know whether you're familiar with, Joe, but they basically migrated rules of like courses and everything, that the place of supply is now in the country where the kind of end consumer is located.
Yeah, there's a situation where you can get double taxation, as far as I'm aware, unless they've fixed that. And it's not the EU's fault; it's the UK government's fault. They've not followed suit, right?
Yeah, correct. Unfortunately, at the moment, now I'm not 100% sure what the current rules are with the UK. Now, I believe there is still a point where they could fall under a double taxation, which is obviously a bit unfortunate and frustrating for a lot of clients that do sell kind of digital courses. But if you're because the EU migrated, the UK didn't really comment on it. We are working on getting kind of up-to-date advice on that as well. So hopefully we'll be able to update both yourself and your clients, and also our clients, quite shortly with some positive news. But yeah, it's the UK that are holding us back on that one, unfortunately, at the moment.
Yeah, and sadly, so we've got a few clients. Some choose to follow all of the rules, and some will only want to follow the UK's rules. But according to both rules, the UK see that you owe VAT, and the EU see that you owe VAT, and there's no way of discounting them. So
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to navigate in that regard, because it was, I'd say, a sudden change. I think if I remember correctly, it hasn't even been that long ago, but I don't know about you, this year has flown. But we are, November, I think last year we got the notice that the rules were kind of changing, maybe before that. But there wasn't too much kind of advance warning on that for kind of, clients. So we did look at, getting the education as much as possible, but unfortunately the UK didn't comment on it for a while. So it is kind of, there are cases where it can cause a bit more tax than you'd like, but hopefully that will be resolved quite shortly for everyone, to make it a bit more easier to sell cross border. And then, as we've just kind of spoke about with that digital TVE services, they typically do fall under kind of like streaming, PDF downloads, broadcasting, services where supply is automated. Again, these are now looking at, courses being delivered, any events that are happening in person, online as well. So it kind of, does have a wider scope moving forward. And then one of the last things that I'm just kind of going to look at briefly, which I think would be quite interesting, is just kind of that exporting via kind of marketplaces. So a lot of online marketplaces become the deemed supplier for VAT purposes in the following kind of cases. So goods imported from the third territories or third countries in consignments with an intrinsic value of less than €150. So going back to kind of, as we mentioned, with that Amazon giving you that IOSS number, and sales of goods from a non-EU seller which are already in free circulation located in the EU at point of checkout. So if you're, say, holding stock with Amazon in Germany, and you're kind of utilizing maybe that European fulfillment network where you've got that stock held locally in one country and then distributing around, they would supply you with their union OSS as a non-EU business. So you don't need that kind of additional registration for that. It would only be triggered if you do multi-channel fulfillment and utilize your IOSS on top of that as well.
the where the second point where it mentioned free
Yeah.
circulation,
hmm
so that I understand. Like, is that where you're saying it would be if it's held on Amazon? Or
So when we say free circulation, it's more so goods that so when you import the goods and kind of cover that import VAT, import duties, your goods are then free for circulation around the EU. So that's where that would kind of be, that was where that would come from, if
So
that makes sense.
So if I bought from a German wholesaler and the goods were stored there, would that count as free circulation already because they're already in the sort of German system?
Yeah, 100%. So if you kind of purchase goods from someone locally on the ground, there's no customs. Once goods are in the EU, they're purchased, whether they're, sourced locally, whether they're imported, there's no further like import VAT because obviously there is you're at free to trade around the EU, both business to business, B2C. It just really depends on those kind of rules that, come about. But they would be free for circulation no matter whether they're kind of purchased on the ground or not.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries. And then, yeah, I guess like lastly, this is the last slide, and then we'll kind of be jumping into a bit of a Q&A. But the just a bit further explanation on that. So, as I mentioned, if you're kind of holding stock in an EU member state, just for those sales through a marketplace, they will be acting as that deemed supplier. So, you do need that VAT number, which I'm sure some questions might kind of cover in a moment. But you do still need that VAT number, but you won't need that OSS. So, if you've got, say, a Pan EU program, which I know is quite popular through sellers growing through Amazon, for example, you would have maybe 3, 4 markets open. You'd need 3 or 4 VAT numbers, but you wouldn't need, anything other than that. So you just kind of need to get your local registrations in place, and then Amazon will take account of any kind of, goods going cross border from those. And that is the end of my slides today. So yeah, hopefully that was a bit insightful for you and everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liam. So we've got a list of questions, but if anybody is out there, YouTube, please feel free to send through some questions. And I would be remiss as a wannabe YouTuber if you didn't leave a like, or if I didn't ask you to leave a like on the video if you've watched so far. So please do that. Let Liam know that he's done a good job.
Yeah, please
really
do.
And so yeah, we've got a message from Mertza. With platforms like Amazon, export sales need to be DDP. So how would non-union, i.e. greater than 150 euros, sales be managed if the VAT amount is removed by the platform? Thank you very much, Mertaza.
Okay. So what I'm assuming here is you mean kind of goods going that, for example, if someone in France purchased on Amazon that are above like 150 euros. Now, if you're only registered for the UK kind of, system, UK Amazon, it's my understanding that actually the Amazon don't automatically act as a deemed supplier on those supplies. They only act as it under the IOSS, solution. So when it comes to your question, and maybe it might be good for us to maybe follow up actually after this kind of discussion, because it might be good to get a grasp on your sales. But it's my understanding that you don't automatically collect it. Basically, it's either you push it to yourself or it goes on your end consumer, but you would need that kind of VAT registration to account for those sales. But again, it kind of depends on exactly how you mean with your kind of sales, and it might be good for us to kind of connect separately on that one. But hopefully that helped in the interim kind of discover that. But yeah.
And Camilla, I'm glad to see that you're there, because you were one of the people I was thinking of when speaking about this, because it pains me because I know you do things properly compared to some of the more, I suppose, less compliance-focused businesses that don't do things properly. So yeah, it's always painful to see people paying tax twice. And Ben, you should speak with Liam at SimplyVAT.
Yes, please do, because I think, this is one of the limitations that it does seem quite overwhelming when you look at it from, a base overview, but when you really delve into it, there are a lot of options that do make it quite seamless for sole traders to explore that, cross-border growth. For example, we briefly touched on, but when you sell to EU businesses, you can ship under a DAP Incoterm. You don't have to collect any VAT. There's no kind of rules on that at all. So you can really grow your business. It is just making sure that, your clients are aware that, if, for example, if it's physical goods, but if your clients are aware that the goods will be shipped under that Incoterm, because I do also see a lot of clients receiving a bit of backlash from their consumers just because they weren't made aware. So always, always, always make it in a big print, because no one, including myself, I should probably not really admit, but we don't always read the fine print, do we? So especially when we look at those kind of, little things, it's always best to make it as big as possible.
And I suppose just for Ben's sake as well, a few years ago, you had to register, didn't you? If you were selling, so Ben sells on Amazon, you had to register if you had Pan EU in every single, or in like all 5 EU countries, or 7 or whatever it is now. But if he's now delivering by FBM, so by merchant, is he able to use the IOSS scheme rather than having to worry about, registering in Italy, Spain, France, Germany?
So it is going to depend on the exact kind of Amazon you run through. For example, you won't be able to utilize the Pan EU scheme kind of through that, to my knowledge, just because it might still trigger. It basically varies, but technically, yes, as long as they're Skype fulfilled by merchant, goods are held inside the EU, or even utilizing Amazon's EFN, with getting their IOS number, holding that stock in the UK and then growing across, then you will avoid kind of getting those local VAT numbers. But unfortunately, if you go down the traditional Pan EU method, you need a VAT number in every single member state where your goods are. And that is because Amazon will just grab your stock and move it. So it kind of migrates between these member states. So it is something that unfortunately is kind of, unavoidable when you enter into that program.
But I know that Ben does have FBM, and he does it quite well. He also does FBA, but I know he keeps that clear separation. So maybe for him, I'm thinking if it feels overwhelming, an easy gateway could be do the FBM first, because was there an alarm going off there? There could be a much easier gateway, basically, to dip your toe in the water.
Yeah, I do agree. And yeah, apologies. I think that was my fire alarm. I'm being tested. It happens every Monday. I was hoping we could avoid it this morning, but unfortunately not. But yeah, I think if you're looking at dipping your toes in the water and just kind of growing it, FBM would probably be the best solution. But I would always recommend looking into those direct intricacies with Amazon, just because they may have certain rules. But obviously under FBM, as long as you ship the correct manner, it should all be perfect.
And also, Murtaza, thank you very much for the comment. That sounds good. Thank you. So Fabio's left a comment to say, what about VAT on non-VAT products like food, books, etc.? So I think he means like reduced rate or zero rated products. I've noticed when I sell in the Channel Islands that VAT gets applied. So I'm wondering whether the same applies for international sales. And I'm guessing by that as well, he means that he's selling from the UK. If you could clarify that there, Fabio, that would be great. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, it's going to vary because each member state, so obviously it may be non-VAT ratable in the UK, but unfortunately is not in every single member state. So for example, in some member states, it will depend on exactly kind of what it is, what the ingredients are, all that kind of stuff. But typically it might fall under a reduced rate or zero rated, but it will depend on kind of your flow of shipments, what you're doing, whether you can apply for an exemption. So, I mean, yeah, this would be a great kind of topic for us to maybe catch up on separately, because it'd be good to learn a bit more about what you're doing, how you're selling, where the goods are going to, what your plans are, because even if they're, VAT might not be applied, but you still might need to note the sale. It kind of depends. And also, even if one of your products is non-VAT vatable, it might be that a different product is, so you would still trigger that need. But yeah, it'd be good to kind of maybe catch up separately on that one.
And I think also there are some certain rules that have started to get applied in the Channel Islands. So even if you're selling from the UK to the Channel Islands, any product is zero rated for those purposes, because the UK consider it an export. But I think, and I have seen it with quite a lot of our clients, that actually Amazon now starts to collect a little bit of VAT on your behalf and remit it to the Channel Islands tax authorities. So I'm not an expert in that side, and I don't know when they changed the rules, but there definitely is a rule change where the marketplace is sort of responsible for collecting something. So that might be why you're seeing that, even if it is a reduced or non-VATable product. I would say check your settings on your actual SKU to make sure that it's actually set up to be a non-VAT product. But it sounds like you're already on top of that, so it's probably something more to do with the fact that the marketplaces need to collect it. So we've got another question that came in advance. So if somebody wishes to avoid the hassle of VAT registration as much as possible, i.e. everyone, what's the easiest way to achieve this while expanding across Europe to test the markets?
So if you're looking, I'm going to assume this person is probably selling on their own website, maybe. But I would say the easiest way to kind of utilize that would be delivered at place shipments. So obviously you're not collecting VAT, it gets pushed on to your end customer. So you don't have to worry about any kind of VAT registration, any sales. You can just go straight from the offset. The only thing as well I might mention on that one would be if you're utilizing, say the Amazon iOS, that would be a great way to test the market if you're already on Amazon, because you can kind of look at, growing there. You're already, say, registered in the UK. I'm looking maybe like a UK business, but you could always utilize that kind of iOS number to kind of test. Or if you're wanting to kind of dip your toes in a little bit further under your own website, you could always register for that iOS, because it does tend to be obviously a bit more simplified, and it typically, I'm going to say, takes around 3 days maximum once the application is submitted to the tax offices to get back. So we could start conversations on a Monday. You could have it, and be up and running latest Friday. It really does depend on, how fast they get back. But that's always a good way, and it removes that kind of burden of waiting for the VAT registrations. Because sometimes they can take a little long. In Germany, for example, it takes up to 12 weeks. So obviously it is about that forward planning in advance.
And what about deregistration? So if someone dips their toe in the water, within a week they've got their VAT number or their IOSS number, and 2 months later they want to deregister, is that just as straightforward, or is there a lot of sort of headache and red tape?
So
And apologies if you don't get involved in that side, so just say if you don't.
So I don't handle deregistrations directly, but obviously I have been involved in conversations. I normally work more so on the kind of inbound kind of sales side, but when it comes to deregistration, it is pretty much straightforward of just kind of, ensuring that it's put through as a deregistration. But what we need to ensure, so for example, if it's iOS, I would say if it's under the IOSS shipment, it doesn't take that long. But for example, locally, if you're registered, let's say in Spain, I'm just trying to think, there's a annual requirement for a filing. So we wouldn't be able to get you deregistered until we submitted all relevant returns, which would include the annual. So that would be something that I would, look at maybe separately. But yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't really answer the question, but it's not as much of a red tape as people think. I think it's all about looking at what registrations you have to ensure that the correct kind of, route to deregister is kind of taken.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And what about how frequently, and this would be the IOSS really rather than each of the local ones, how frequently does someone need to submit those returns?
It's a monthly return under IOSS, so it's submitted monthly payments. So yeah, it happens. Yeah,
And
every
how
month.
long's the deadline after that? Is it like how immediate does it have to be?
So typically, um, I believe the actual registration to get it kind of submitted is the 17th of every month. But typically what we do is, so for example, through us, we calculate your return. If we've got like an API integration with the client, not mainly Shopify, let's say, we would also pull that data, calculate the return by latest 7th every month, get the client to approve it, and then we submit it. I believe the deadline is the 17th, or ideally that's when we'd like to get it done by. But I do think we have up until maybe like the 25th or end of the month. But I can re-clarify that with you. I don't work with deadline submissions directly myself, unfortunately, but it is somewhere between, mid-month to latest. But I would say the earlier you can kind of get on it would be the better take to really approach, especially because, as we both know, people don't really want to look at taxes that often. So the sooner you get it out of the way, I guess the quicker for everyone. Just get that payment done and dusted, and then you're able to kind of get on with reboosting the sales again for the next month.
And is it easier though than say like UK VAT, because can you include expenses within the IOSS, or is it just that people, typically your clients would just connect via API, you guys pull through the data and just prepare it, so in theory it could be done on the 2nd? Is that?
So yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think this is where the IOSS maybe can sometimes cause a bit of confusion. It's primarily a registration and return for remitting supply VAT. So you're not able to reclaim any expenses incurred. No import VAT can be reclaimed under the IOSS, nothing like that. It's purely just a simplified scheme where you kind of collect VAT from your end customer, remit it under the IOSS number, pop your IOSS on your parcel, and it kind of aids with clearing through customs a lot quicker. Well, should aid with clearing through customs a lot quicker. But it could be done as quickly as possible. We calculate the return obviously as soon as we kind of get that data. So as mentioned, we like to kind of give people the return back calculated by the 7th of the month. But that's when we kind of notify you, log on, approve it. If you approve it on the 7th, you can pay it on the 7th. Done and dusted. You don't need to worry about it then until next month. Because I know, obviously, not many people like to spend time, really focusing on tax. It's such a thing that people just want to pay
How
it and get
dare
it over
they?
with. I
How
know.
dare they? It's the funnest part of the day.
I know. We love taxes.
And here's another question we had before. So what's the threshold for needing an EU VAT registration?
So there is no threshold regarding kind of needing that EU VAT registration, as we've kind of discussed, but it really just depends on how the shipments are happening. So, for example, if you're not collecting VAT, then you don't need to worry about getting that VAT. But if you are going to be collecting VAT or holding stock, then it's from the first supply, unfortunately.
And does the same apply to digital goods as well? Sorry to just jump.
No, I think that's a great question. So digital goods, they are generally kind of taxable. So you need that registration from the first kind of input, and that would be getting that non-union OSS kind of registered. Unfortunately, there's no way of like not collecting VAT on digital supplies, so you would need to get that non-union from the offset.
Cool, thank you. And do I need a VAT number in every EU country that I sell into?
So it depends and it varies. So typically, we would look at if you're going under the OSS simplification schemes, then no, because you've kind of got that OSS simplification scheme. But it depends on where the goods are going from and to. So this is where kind of like, SimplyVAT, we offer kind of a free 15-minute consultation to all clients. And the team kind of delve into this. But I would say the most common one we see when it falls under this question would be holding stock in the UK or US, shipping across, do I need a VAT number in every single country? I'm not going to hold stock locally. And the simple answer is if you're doing DAP shipments, then not at all. If you're doing DDP shipments, then are your goods below €150? Let's get you IOSS registered, get that simplified scheme in place. If it's above €150, then unfortunately, if you're wanting to continue DDP shipments, then it would be, registering locally in each member state, or we can explore, other options that might be available.
And I'm going to quickly ask another question here aside from that. Sorry, Dan, in the background. Imagine that I'm a small UK business. I'm not UK VAT registered, so I'm just getting started, but I'm also making sales, maybe by accident, to the EU. Do you need a UK VAT number before you register for EU VAT, or before you can register for IOSS or anything like that? Or is that able to be done without a UK VAT number?
I think that's a great question. So not for OSS solutions, you don't need one.
So you don't need a UK VAT number?
Not for IOSS, no. So it really is aimed towards kind of those smaller sellers. So well, I say it's aimed towards those small sellers. I think it came with, the air of, smaller sellers having easy access to the EU market rather than requirements to obviously obtain those local registrations. But it is really utilized by a lot of different kind of businesses, small, large, VAT registered, sole traders, non-VAT registered. You don't need to be kind of UK VAT registered to obtain that. The thing where you do require a UK VAT registration is some countries, for example, France. If you're holding stock locally in France or wanting to explore the French Amazon market, by utilizing the FBA in France, you would require a UK VAT number to obtain that registration. So some local registrations require you to, but those OSS schemes you're not required to.
Cool, thank you. And we've got a few more questions that we've had in advance, but for anyone watching, if you do have any others, would love to answer them. So please feel free to share them. And Lena, we're not ignoring you. I think that's a really cool strategy that you've mentioned, but I didn't want to seem like you were showing off to everyone. So I thought I'd leave that there. I think it's quite cool though. Thank you for sharing it. Another pre-question that we had, so when do I need an OSS registration and what is the benefit of an OSS number? If I've already made sales, can I backdate the OSS return?
So, well, this is a good one because when it comes to, for example, if you need an OSS registration, you need it if you're either doing digital sales, that would obviously be non-union, or holding stock locally. That's recommended. Obviously, it's optional, so you don't ever need one if you're holding stock locally on the ground, but it is kind of, I guess, definitely recommended. Now, technically, a non-union OSS cannot be backdated. However, what we would do, obviously, if anyone watching is kind of, panicking, thinking, oh no, I've made sales digitally, I really need to get this kind of resolved, get in touch. We can explore your options that are available to you. But technically, you can't really backdate an OSS application, but we can definitely kind of look at the options to make it a bit more feasible and accessible for everyone.
Yeah, and I think I'd say through experience, I've seen when you guys have handled it that EU governments aren't going to complain if you come forward and pay them money that they didn't know they should have had. And Patrick from Prestige Classic has left a couple of comments, and that has reminded me that he did ask in advance about how a Northern Ireland seller's treated. And he's also said, if you are selling well in FBA UK plus a UK VAT registered, then getting VAT registered in Europe and selling FBA Europe is worthwhile. There's not that much hassle for Patrick, which I think is linking on from what Ben was talking about earlier. Oh, look, and he's bigging you up as well.
Perfect.
But yeah, Patrick did ask how the interaction with Northern Ireland works for sellers. So again, sorry if that's putting you on the spot. If you don't know, we can defer it. But
So Northern Ireland's a bit of a tricky one. I would say it's always good for us to look at it on an individual basis, because when we look at Northern Ireland, it varies about where the goods are going from, where they're going to. So it is a good one to ask, but it really does kind of vary. For example, let's just say if you're holding stock under your own website in Northern Ireland as a UK business, you firstly need an XI validation number, XI number on your EORI, and also your VAT. That then utilizes you. So you can get a UK one-stop shop registration, which I'm sure, Joe, you might be a little bit more familiar with than maybe I am, just because we don't handle them, unfortunately. But when it comes to, say, UK OSSs, it's only eligible for clients that are holding stock in Northern Ireland or Northern Ireland registered businesses, because there is a free trade agreement with, obviously, the EU, where Northern Ireland is deemed as an EU member state for kind of B2B and B2C sales. But I would say it really depends on the flow. It'd be good to maybe visit it in an individual kind of conversation, just to kind of get to, the downs of exactly what the goods are coming from and to. But yeah, sorry, I don't know too much about
that's okay.
more than that.
I'm the same, but I suppose for reference, like all of our processes that we have internally or macros or tools, we have a special toggle that's like, is the person Northern Ireland IOSS registered? And whether they are or aren't depends on how the treatment is. So it does get very complicated, which is why I think Patrick was trying to ask some questions about it. How long does it take to get VAT registered? Now, you answered this for the IOSS. I believe you said it's super fast, several days, quicker than in the UK. It's but what about, I suppose, if someone's registering individually, locally in an EU jurisdiction?
So it varies. It really does really varies, to be completely transparent. So the longest timelines that we tend to see would typically fall around the 8 to 12 week mark. They tend to be countries such as like France, Germany, Netherlands, for example, takes around 7 to 8 weeks. But if you have an Article 23 license, which allows you to postpone import VAT, it takes a couple of weeks longer. So it boosts you up to that 8 to 12 weeks. But yeah, it kind of typically does vary. So we see it quite often with, clients going into pan-EU. They might have France, Germany, Spain, Czech, and Poland. They tend to be the 5 most populous, right? Obviously, during that timeline, they've got all very different timeframes. So Poland and Czech take around 2 to 3 weeks. So Spain, the actual registration period for Spain is around 3 to 5 weeks. I just saw your comment there, Lena. I think with the kind of Spain, what takes around a year is actually the vice validation in Spain, which can be a little bit, frustrating for clients who are expanding there. The vice validation is basically, it allows you to collect VAT. Well, sorry, not collect VAT. What am I trying to say here? So for the vice validation, it's for B2B inter-community supplies of goods. So if you're doing Amazon FBA, your goods going from, say, pan-EU scheme, if they're moving your stock from Poland into Spain, that's an inter-community acquisition of goods and an inter-community supply of goods. So that's where the vice validation would kick in. But yeah, it does take around a year for that to kind of come into play, unfortunately. But yeah, so it varies to answer your question, but it typically, I wouldn't say it exceeds longer than 8 to 12 weeks to get that local VAT number. But obviously, as Lena has highlighted, there can be kind of additional intricacies that we do need to kind of take into consideration.
If I remember, Spain requires, is it apostille? Like some special stamp and signed, translated things. It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, so in Spain, you're required notarized and apostilled power of attorney documents. So that's an additional kind of element that you need to kind of get into play to submit that application. Same with Poland. Poland, you need sworn translation documents. So each country just have its little quirks, but it's nothing, obviously, that we can't support with as well.
And I realised we've not actually touched upon the dreaded P word, pricing. So are you able to give people an idea of how much SimplyVAT charge for this sort of work? Because that's a big barrier for most people, right? Like I'm sure Ben, who mentioned, he's thinking, oh, there's all these filing requirements, there's extra accounting costs. Are you able to give people a rough idea of how much SimplyVAT charge?
So it really does vary. I think it's best to kind of visit it on an individual basis, especially because we have kind of pan-EU packages available. We have different areas. For example, we have an IOSS Express route, which I know, Joe, obviously you do kind of pinpoint your clients down. At the moment, our fees for the IOSS are, 150 to get registered and £85 flat rate. Obviously, that's relevant as of, today, 7th of July.
Month. That's
per month.
Yeah.
But the way we differentiate with the IOSS is that flat rate, we don't charge per consignment or parcel. So, for example, if you're doing 1,000 parcels or you're doing 10 parcels a month, it's £85. At the moment, obviously, we are forever, looking at options available to help, bring smaller sizes onto the market. But apart from that, yeah, other like individual countries, it'd be best to kind of have discussions because it depends on where the client's registered, if they need a fiscal rep. But the IOSS, which is under that IOSS Express link, which obviously you've got for your clients, that's all available there as well, which with those kind of fees.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, so nobody quote don't quote Liam on any of this, but
Not
in
yet.
general, to get started with IOSS for the smaller sellers is a couple of €100 sort of max, and then 100 or so a month. I have seen other firms charge much more. I've seen people do it, like you said, per order. So again, if you've only got 3 orders, it works, but if you've got 3,000, it doesn't. And also for anyone watching, this is something like doing this sort of webinar format is something that at the firm we haven't done for a couple of years. So if this is stuff that's been useful or interesting, please let us know. We've got several other ones or ideas in the pipeline and guests planned. We wanted to get kind of specialist people who really know their stuff, like Liam and SimplyVAT on. So if you found it useful, do let us know, because we do sort of need the feedback and the positive reinforcement to want to do it. So would appreciate that. If anybody's got any final questions, I appreciate we're about an hour now. Do let us know. If not, Liam, I'll let you give any closing remarks and we can check out any final questions that might come in.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say thank you again so much for hosting us. It's obviously been a real pleasure, and we've had some great questions. I would just say if you're really unsure about EU taxes, obviously feel free to get in touch with us at SimplyVAT. You can always speak with me directly as well. I'll get Joe to kind of circulate my email following our conversation today. So if anyone's got any direct queries, I can support in that. But yeah, I think apart from that, it's been great, and hopefully insightful for yourself and your clients. But we will see. Hopefully we get some positive feedback.
Yeah, thank you, Liam. And we because this was the first one in a while, the way we've registered for this is we have emailed everyone without trying to be spammy or collecting emails. So if anybody does want to be put in touch with Liam or SimplyVAT, do reply to the sort of bulk email that we sent out, because we've not shared your information. Liam's not going to be hounding you. It's not sort of how either of us work. So if you're interested, let us know. And yeah, then we can kind of pass details across. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me, Liam. And thank you everybody else who's still here. Thanks a lot.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.